soils. You're trying to help someone understand soils. What are some like key words that come to mind? Texture, soil texture. So sand is like the biggest particle along that continuum, followed by silt. And this is very relative here, but it's at least somewhat instructive of the fact that like clay that's probably an understatement in terms of the reflection of how minuscule clay particles are in relationship to silt and sand. Clay particles are actually like plate-like, as opposed to being more granular in the case of silt and sand. And so if you imagine like the nature of these platey particles, that's what makes them so much more compaction prone, that it's possible to rearrange those particles so that they actually seal and keep water from infiltrating, which is another reason why clay is such an important component in earthen building. It's rare that you'll ever dig up a sample of soil from the ground and find that you've got pure sand, or this is 100% clay, right? It's an aggregate mix of at least 2, if not 3, of these different particle sizes. And so the soil pyramid reflects that, which has sand on one axis, silt on another, and clay on the third. And so what it then reflects is based on the relative constituent percentages of these different particles, we can determine like where we lie along that soil pyramid, what the true texture is of the soil. But there's one vocabulary word that we haven't shared that kind of fits into characterizing soil texture, but it's the L word, the loam, right? And so what's loam? It's the best of all three in that it's kind of the ideal mix of all three. And it can vary. You could have a silty loam or a sandy loam, but like your ideal loam is kind of right in this sweet spot where we've got maybe 10 to 20% clay, and then the remainder is a mix of both silt and sand. So sand provides like exceptional drainage. What's a downside to sand? So yeah,
exceptional
like
drainage.
Poor water retention. The capacity to support biological activity is less than ideal in sand. Like organic matter or compost has very high cation exchange capacity relative to sand. So it's able to like chemically bond to fertility, to nutrients, and like retain it and prevent leaching. Whereas sand is much more prone to leaching. And so for anyone who's gardened on sandy soils, you know that you can add compost annually and basically just watch it disappear. And so we can basically contrast that to the other end of the spectrum, those characteristics, their nutrient retention and water retention, right? Clay is exceptional in its ability to hold water, which is also a detriment if you're looking to grow vegetables. So the waterlogging becomes a real challenge. And that's why loam places us in that sweet spot where we have some of the water retention characteristics and nutrient retention of the clay, but we've also got reasonable drainage and adequate pore space for water, air, and biological activity.
Structure is kind of, you can think about the ideal structure would be what we call like a crumb structure. So these are aggregates of all the different fractions of the particles that kind of come together to form clumps. And the good thing about these clumps when they form in the soil is that they allow a lot of pores, which may start with a sand particle, like he said, is millions of times larger than clay, but you might have a sand particle surrounded by a bunch of silty particles that are surrounded by clay, which makes up a clump. Those being next to each other allow for lots of air pockets in between. Well, when you have that on a good scale, where there's a lot of crumb to air, good ratio, that's the idea of decompaction. So if they're all too close and pressed together, you don't have enough air, you don't have enough space for infiltration. The way that we treat soil can change the structure dramatically. So if we're doing a lot of tillage or something like that, we might be fluffing up, we might be decompacting for a little while, but we're opening up the soil to a lot of processes that can kind of degrade the structure through time. So, and this plays into the soil food web, which is another key aspect of, the soil biota, which really creates and maintains the soil structure. So if we're basically wiping out that food web's work every year, over time we're degrading the capacity of the soil to have that structure that we're looking for, and we have to continue to approximate that structure mechanically, which is not necessarily something that we want to have to be doing every year. We've been kind of talking about one scale of structure, and we might want to zoom out and talk about the larger layering of soils. Up here we've got our plants or whatever, and in our first layer, it's relatively shallow. It is referred to the O horizon. That's basically, does anybody know what O stands for in this case? Organic, yeah. So this is essentially comprised of actual living matter or organic matter that's breaking down in various states of decomposition. And then let's say we're in a really good spot and we have a pretty good next layer, which is commonly known as topsoil. A, yeah. Topsoil. That's where most of the soil food web is doing most of its work. That's the living section, the living fraction of the soil. There's a little A sub E horizon, or the E horizon, which stands for alluvial. So the E horizon comes from a process of some kind of weathering and leaching where the larger particles within the A horizon end up in the E horizon. And sometimes you might be able to see one clearly, sometimes you can't really, but often it's kind of sandier particles that are at the bottom of the A horizon. That's the B, that's the subsoil. There's a lot of minerals in the subsoil, but there's not a lot of plant root activity down there. A little bit, some tap-rooted plants might be getting down in there, and there's a little bit of biological activity, but very minimal compared to A.
C is the one that I never have a good explanation of exactly what it is. They define it as the chemical layer in edible forest gardens. And D is that parent material or bedrock. Our soils are derived directly from the original bedrock on the site. So the D in that case becomes the durable layer. It's literally the base rock from which soils were, from which material was weathered and then deposited as soils.
And so one of the ideas that we were talking about with the subsoiling here is that we're getting our mechanical implement down into this subsoil layer and we're dragging that through. And the idea there is to expand the A horizon of the soil down into what was previously the B. So we're decompacting that and we're allowing for avenues of roots and stuff to get down into there and hopefully deep in our A layer.
The nature of our parent material is going to dictate qualities and characteristics of the soils in which we're growing. So if you've got a granitic bedrock, it tends to be much lower in pH, so the soils tend to be more acidic. If your soils are underlain by limestone bedrock, you're going to tend to have a sweeter soil that has a higher pH.
One of the important things to keep in mind with the pH is that it affects, among other things, it affects nutrient availability to plants. We have the pH on the x-axis here, going from 3 to 9, but I just had enough space, go up to 14. At a certain pH, nitrogen or phosphorus may have a certain availability. Once you get to a certain spectrum, it's fully available to plants. So basically, if it's too acidic, it's getting bound up into other chemical forms that are unavailable to plants. Same thing on the very basic end of the spectrum. When you're trying to plan around this, you kind of have to have a mind towards first monitoring the pH of your soil, getting an idea of what it is in different areas, and then potentially changing it if you need to be growing different crops. So you could think about it as taking all the nutrients that you need, lining them up, and then finding some ideal point where, say at like 6.7 here, all of the nutrients that we're interested in are pretty available. You might have to make some compromises, but not all nutrients are available in the same pH ranges to their maximum extent.
The ideal range for garden soils generally is said to be like slightly acidic, just between kind of 6.2 to 6.5. One of the few catch-all solutions to just about every soil-related problem that you have. You can't go wrong with adding organic matter. Your soils don't hold water, add organic matter. Your soils tend to be waterlogged and wet. Adding organic matter is going to help create a sponge that'll better help buffer those extremes a bit.
In a big way, it depends on exactly what type of organic matter. So if you are adding oak leaves or pine needles that are high in tannic acid, you're very likely going to have an acidifying effect on the soil.
The soil food web is one term used to describe the relationship of microorganisms present in the soil, recognizing that They play a crucial role in nutrient cycling, in crumb structure formation, and in like the availability of mineral nutrients to plants. So bacteria and fungi are like the basis of the soil food web. And when we're in early succession, our soils are dominated largely by bacteria. As we progress further along in time, so we shift from an annual dominated landscape into perennials, and then thereafter into like woody plants, we start to see that balance shift towards a more fungal dominated ecosystem.
As we get deeper into the timeline, on the successional timeline, we start to see a lot of more interconnectedness between the different organisms that are in the ecosystem. So the fungal relationships allow different trees to become connected to each other, as it were, through means of sharing resources. So they have root exudates. They basically put out sugar through their roots. They're kind of like giving a free lunch away right at their root base, and that encourages fungi to come in and form these relationships with their roots, whereby they're able to transfer water and minerals and a couple other resources. And so through time, you'll have trees developing these relationships with a wide variety of different fungal partners that they act in symbiotic relationships with.
If we're looking to establish an orchard or a forest garden in an existing field, it's highly likely that we're doing that in a bacterially dominated soil food web. And so by adding various forms of woody debris, then we're creating habitat for fungi, and we're helping shift that soil food web towards the type of biological populations that those plants want.
Specific trees or families of trees will have relationships with specific types of fungi. That's why mushroom hunters will often look for a specific type of vegetative growth, which will indicate to them that there's likelihood that there will be a certain type of fungal growth associated with those trees. If you're trying to grow an orchard of, a specific type of tree, you might be interested in mulching with material from around other trees of that same family in the forest, because you'll be inoculating with a whole host of different fungal species that might have beneficial relationships with those particular types of trees.
When I plant trees, I usually inoculate roots with a broad spectrum fungal inoculant that includes a range of mycorrhizal species. So at least you're trying to make the potential for those relationships possible in a soil where they might not already be present. As kind of a recap and wrap up, just a reminder of how crucial soils are to all life on the planet. Building soil, maintaining soil productivity, soil health, enhancing soil biological populations, and preventing erosion at all costs should be like paramount, almost like when it comes to actually like framing, how do we measure the success of our projects, right? Are we building soil? Are we preventing erosion? Are we keeping it in permanent cover? And are we looking to like nurture the types of vegetation we're growing by enhancing or supporting the soil biology that's crucial to that relationship? Here, what we want to do is dig several soil test pits and do what we can to observe the horizons, look at the texture of the soil and see how it feels, try to enhance our ability to like determine physical characteristics of the soil by sight, by touch, by taste perhaps, smell. And let's pick 3 different spots that have different vegetation on them and that are that vary in like their elevation profile. So we've got kind of somewhere in here will be like our upland spot, maybe a spot where there's more forbs and less like grass, that doesn't look like quite as rich pasture. And then perhaps one other spot that is either different in that it's a little bit wetter, or as you excavate your pit, it's a great opportunity to actually lay the materials out in a way that reflects the strata below. So instead of just making a big pile, like dig out the sod, put that to the side, and then basically like lay out the soil in a continuum as it comes out of the hole.
Rocks and all the same.
It's a little bit tricky to see exactly where that transition is as we look in the pit, but it seems as if we do transition between an A and a B horizon. It was really just like the first probably 4 to 6 inches where there wasn't a lot of small to medium-sized stones. I'd encourage people to like grab a small handful and get it wet. Thanks. Clay performs a lot differently when it's wet than when it's dry, and it can be really deceptive. Clay and silt are often mistaken. When you get this stuff wet, if there's a lot of clay in it, you'll feel it because the stick, it changes. And there's probably is some clay in this material. When I feel this stuff, it does feel like it holds together a bit, and there is a bit of stick, but it doesn't feel like it's certainly not a heavy clay. To me, it feels as if we do have some clay in this, but it's not a heavy clay soil. We've got silt, which can often be deceptive because it can be kind of smushy, and greasy, but not like super sticky. Another test is to basically like work the clay into a ribbon and kind of feed it out between your thumb and your forefinger and see how well does it hold together. Does it crack? Does it hold together at all? And the aggregates in this was making it difficult for me to really even feel that. But let's go to the next hole and take a look. There's even more aggregate in this mix. I'll pass this around too if anybody wants to feel it. Probably right about there, that's what I'm noticing, is that we go from kind of a deeper, darker black to more of a lighter brown. And so what we're seeing there is our B horizon, the subsoil. This is one good reason to lay your materials out like this, because if you just make a big pile, there's a chance that you're going to be throwing your subsoil back on top of your topsoil, which is something you definitely don't want. Or if our A horizon's fairly shallow, there's a chance that we're actually flipping subsoil on top of our topsoil, which is really not good at all. It took thousands of years for this to form like this. So this definitely feels different to me. This is another test that sometimes you'll do where you can like set it in your palm and just like see how many times you can do that before it falls. And the vegetation, just the change in vegetation to me would be one reason why if I was taking a soil test, I would treat this area differently than that. It feels like we've got a higher clay content in our mix here. Does everybody feel like they could agree with that? You can feel the difference. I'll sometimes even like just listen to it as I like work it with my thumb, like listen to how the sound it makes as I peel my thumb away, and you can kind of hear the way that it sticks. So let's look at one more hole. As a general theme, the lower you are in the landscape, the wetter it's going to be. And that's just a common pattern that you can project. But this could be partly a function of a change in the texture of the soil, but it's also likely the fact that this is just a place where the water table expresses itself, and it could be because there's shallower bedrock here, or there's a compacted B horizon, that the subsoil is just like restricting water infiltration. But the fact that we've got a developed spring right next to us, it feels different than the last hole a little bit. Would you guys agree?
Like there's more, I feel like more.
It feels more greasy. It's not sticking nearly as much, right?
It smells too.
It's almost a little like anaerobic, right? So, which isn't surprising given that we see, water rapidly emerging from the hole. So this is a great example of, where you may want to then consider species. You're either going to need to create mounds where you're planting like elevated above ground, which is where swales could be a valuable thing even in a wet place, not for collecting moisture, but for, providing elevated planting. So otherwise we'd look towards like wet tolerant things. And so just like identifying that gradient is really helpful because it starts to help us, our design emerges from our observations of the landscape. That this is a wet soil with a high silt content that's adjacent to like an existing pond, right? We can start to kind of characterize this part of this space based on some of those different components of the scale of permanence. I mean, if you wanted to grow some biomass, either for mulch or for fertility, like in the case of the various alder species that'll do well in wet soils. Cranberries perhaps, willows, like coppiced willows or alders for mulch, biomass, fertility. But if we don't need this space, then I'd be probably less prone to investing a lot here and would focus on areas that show higher productivity potential from the get-go.
This is a test, a really simple test that you can do to visually discern based on the percentages of sand, silt, and clay and organic matter that are present in the soil type. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a soil sample, dilute it in this water, suspend it as much as possible in the water, and then let it settle out.
And ideally we would sift it first. We want to get out a bunch of the big rocks because they're not really going to be part of what we're analyzing.
They could be damaging to your jar.
Yeah.
And we want to, have a high proportion of water to soil. And ideally you'd have a ball jar lid, but your hand ought to work just fine.
And you do want to shake it out pretty well so you can really get the clay kind of to disaggregate. We don't want like sand surrounded by silt and clay. We want to really like shake pretty vigorously so that we can disaggregate those clumps.
The largest particles settle to the bottom almost immediately.
And so this is a real cheapo soil pH meter. You can only use this in solution. You can't just stick this in soil. It has to be aqueous. So this is reading just about 7 right here.
It's not a fully executed test, but you can just start to see as it settles out how the layers start to become visible. For example, the silt and clay layers may be so similar in their coloration that it's very difficult to discern where one ends and the other begins, but more often than not, it's pretty clear, and you can get a decent amount of information from that jar. And once that's fully settled, the water will become clear, and we'll have a very distinct layer of sand, silt, and clay and organic matter visible. So if you wanted to measure the percentages, you would wait until it's fully settled, and then you're measuring from the bottom of the jar to the top of the sample, not to the top of the water. And then you can calculate, roughly